From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I want to welcome you to a series of programs that are put on by the Law Library of Congress in order to help elucidate on the and expand our information on the issues of today. We're very fortunate to have with us today Barry Hill, who is the Senior Counsel for Environmental Governance at the Environmental Protection Agency. At least he was a few months ago when he took a tour of the law library to see how we could help him with his work. And we didn't know that on that fateful day we were going to get such a good friend of the law library out of the deal. He is involved with traveling the world to encourage other governments to enact environmental legislation. And our staff in the law library's reading room and collection services showed him just a few of our 168,000 legal resources that might be of use that are in our reading room. And he was also introduced to Hung Sha Liu, our Director of Legal Research, who and was given a demo of GLIN, the Global Legal Information Network. He thought that database would be useful, both if he was going to a member country, say Kuwait, to see what laws they already have on the books in terms of environmental law, and it would also be useful when he wanted to show a dignitary what those in a neighboring country are doing with such kind of legislation. So not only has he traveled to places like Jordan and Kenya to fulfill his own mission, but he also helped the law library by promoting GLIN wherever he went. We now have contacts in a number of nations in Africa that we didn't have before, thanks to Mr. Hill, so I just want to publicly thank him for his efforts on our behalf. As I mentioned, he is Senior Counsel for Environmental Governance in the Office of International Affairs in the Environmental Protection Agency, and he's worked with EPA in various capacities since 1998, when he left a distinguished career at the Department of the Interior as Associate Solicitor in the Division of Conservation and Wildlife. He's given legal advice on programs and activities of the National Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the biological research functions of the National Geological Survey. Prior to his appointment to the government post, Barry was of counsel to the international law firm of Dick Stein Shapiro, where he practiced environmental law. He is a prolific writer and is about to tell you about his most recent textbook, called Environmental Justice Legal Theory. A gifted teacher, he has taught at Vermont Law School for 20 years. I'm sure in Vermont is what inspired you to be such an active environmentalist, because it's so beautiful up there. In 2001, he was awarded the American Bar Association's Award for Distinguished Achievement in Environmental Law and Policy for his work in the area of environmental justice, environmental law, environmental policy. And he has a long history of outstanding service with the American Bar Association and many other educational institutions. So would you please join me in welcoming a scholar and a friend, Barry Hill.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. As the law librarian said, my job is to travel to different countries and to assist other countries in developing their environmental regulatory agencies. The United States has been involved in environmental law for the last 40 years. When the Environmental Protection Agency was established as an agency by President Nixon. So we are on, for want of a better term, the environmental superhighway, if you will. And what I try to do, along with my colleagues at EPA, is to assist other governments in getting on that superhighway. Some of the governments that I've been dealing with, they've only had environmental regulatory agencies for the last 4 or 5 years. So in many respects, they're in the horse and buggy, if you will, as far as the superhighway is concerned. But eventually, and hopefully, they will be traveling on that superhighway with our assistance. What we do quite a bit is to export intelligence, if you will, technical expertise. There's a lot of technology transfer with what we do as far as other governments are concerned. I stay on the road quite a bit, and I see a lot, and I talk a lot with different people, people in prominent positions in these various governments. And what we're trying to do, again, is to get them on the superhighway, and it keeps me very much involved because it really is one world. Today, I've been asked to make a couple of statements about addressing human environment challenges. What I will be doing is talking about domestic issues as well as international issues. So why don't we begin? My presentation, my overview of a presentation, basically it's in 4 parts. The first part, I will be talking about human environment challenges. What is it? What do we mean by that? Then I will help try to define it and then describe some of these things that are going on, not only in the United States, but also internationally. Part 2, developing sound environmental policy. Once governments have been aware of these human environment challenges in their communities, well, what is it that the government is supposed to do? We'll talk about the rule of law and also sound environmental policy. The third part is implementing sound environmental policy. What does government do? What are they supposed to do? And how do you measure whether or not the government is successful in addressing those problems? And then finally, I decided to use Jordan as an example. Jordan is a country that has received quite a bit of money from the United States. I think it's $4.2 billion over the last 10 years. It's one of the allies in the United States in the Middle East, and they have a very vibrant environmental policy effort, but they're very young. They've only been in existence as an environmental regulatory agency for the last 5 years. Part 1, human environment challenges. What does it mean? The agency uses what we call indicators. Indicators are huge sets of data that the agency uses in order to do an assessment, to make an assessment of what's happening in a community. The first set of data is social indicators. Who lives in these communities? Who are they? Are they Russian immigrants in Brooklyn, New York? Are they Spanish Hispanics in Harlem? What's happening in Texas? How many people are old in the community? How many young people are in that community? Most of the information in the social indicators area comes from the Department of Commerce. Okay. The next is environmental indicators. What we will be doing is talking about that in a few minutes. Health indicators. What is the incidence of cancer? What are the instances of upper respiratory ailments in the community? Now, when I say community, the furthest we can go is the county level. If we go a little bit too much lower than that, there are Privacy Act violations. So you cannot describe what's happening in a community, in a neighborhood, but the information generally comes from the Department of Health and Human Services. The next is economic data. What economic conditions exist in those communities? What are the factories? What are the businesses? So on and so forth. Now, surrounding all of this, okay, is public participation and access to information. Is the public involved in the government's decision-making process? Do they have access to information? This is a requirement in many of the laws that we see. If everything is in balance, all of these circles are balanced, you have what they call environmental justice. In the United States, outside the United States, it's called sustainable development. Environmental justice, according to EPA, is a fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, or economic status. Sustainable development means that we're going to do things simultaneously. We're going to be involved in environmental protection, political development, social development, in a peaceful atmosphere. These are goals to be achieved. Now, there is no set There is no field of environmental justice law. There is no field of sustainable development law. You can't go to the Law Library of Congress, which is the largest law library in the world, and find this field of law, environmental justice law. So what have we done in this area? Well, legal scholars, practitioners, government officials said, what we're going to do, we're going to look at the law that exists on the books. We're going to make a determination as to which law, which field of law will be helpful in addressing these particular themes, environmental justice and sustainable development. The field of law that has been chosen is environmental law. That comes closest to addressing these real life concerns. So if you go to any community in the United States or in other parts of the world, if any of these things are out of balance, you don't have environmental justice. You don't have sustainable development. Research has shown is that if there are significant environmental problems, then the economic aspects of that particular community, as well as the public health aspects of that community, will not be in balance. Remember, these are goals to be achieved. What is the human environment? We're not talking about bugs and bunnies. We're not talking about conservation. We're not talking about preserving wildlife. We're talking about people, public health. Wisconsin has an interesting definition. They say that human environment can be defined as the natural or physical environment and the relationship of people within that environment. It's broad enough to take into consideration sustainable development and environmental justice. What are some of the common issues? I'm going to go through maybe 3, 4 of these common issues, common environmental challenges. Unique exposure pathways and scenarios. Here you see farm workers. They are exposed to pesticides on a daily basis. They work in the fields. Their fingers, their hands might be cut. The poisons will get into their bloodstream. So you have these unique exposure pathways and scenarios based upon reliance on land or water resources that may become pathways of toxic exposure. Now, the same thing exists here in Washington, D.C. Unique exposure pathway. The Anacostia River. What happens every time there is a huge rain here in Washington, D.C.? A combined sewer overflow. Raw sewage goes into the Anacostia River. People fish there. Regardless of the fish advisories that are up, people ignore it because this is maybe the only way that they can get protein in their body. So they will eat the fish. If you eat contaminated fish, you will get sick. Another human environment challenge. Vulnerability of certain populations, infants and the elderly. They're called the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. You have a little girl playing with paint that has lead in it. She will eat the chips of paint because it's sweet. She doesn't understand that lead is toxic, that it can kill her, that it can cause damage to her nerves, to her brains. It may cause problems as far as the ability to speak, other disabling problems. And if she's under 6 years old, that's going to be a huge problem. Low levels of lead in the bloodstream can do all of these damaging things to a young child. Children need, based upon body weight, need 10 times the amount of air and water that an adult needs. It creates huge problems. Lead is ingested into our systems by our mouths or through our noses. It's not ingested through the skin. Now what happens is that our bodies don't know the difference between calcium and lead. So if you ingest this into your body, it goes into your bloodstream and then it settles in your bones. So you have problems with your joints if you are an adult just by breathing lead. Lead is something that has been mined for thousands of years. It is ubiquitous. It's all around us. But it can get into our systems and can cause these huge problems. In Nairobi, they have measured the lead in young children, and they have found that the blood levels are twice the amount of action. Let's say there's an action level that CDC uses in the United States. The blood that has been found, the levels that have been found in young children in Nairobi are twice that action level. So you have huge problems as far as that population is concerned. What's to be done as a practical matter by the Kenyan officials? Next human environment challenge is vulnerability to the built environment. Proximity of residences to industrial areas, overburdened roads, limited emergency evacuation routes all around this country. And as I said earlier, combined sewer overflow outfalls, not only here in Washington, D.C., but in Atlanta, in Georgia, and other places. Raw sewage goes into the rivers where people fish. They're going to get sick if they eat it. Another human environment challenge, cumulative risks impacts due to disproportionate exposure from the aggregation of risks from multiple sources of pollution. You have here a map. EPA has these environmental justice mappers. As long as you have access to a computer, access to an internet, for all communities within the 48 contiguous states of the United States, you can get on the map and you can look at your community. You can see the number of churches, hospitals, regulated communities, unregulated Superfund sites, and others. You can see that your community may be overburdened. You can see that potentially that might be a sick community because of exposure to environmental harms and risks. A major human environment challenge. Now, I have this as challenges: water access and water quality. It has been said that everybody needs water. I'm going to read to you from Vitruvius, Marcus Vitruvius, the 10 books on architecture. Marcus Vitruvius, he was a Roman architect and engineer who flourished in the 1st century BC. We're talking about almost 3,000 years ago. And this is what he wrote as it relates to water. For it is obvious that nothing in the world is so necessary for use as water, seeing that any living creature can, if deprived of grain or fruit or meat or fish or any one of them, can support life by using other foodstuffs. But without water, no animal nor any proper food can be produced, kept in good condition, or prepared. Consequently, we must take great care and pains in searching for springs and selecting them, keeping in view the health of mankind. He goes a little bit further when he talks about testing for good water. He says, springs should be tested and proved in advance in the following ways. If they run free and open, inspect and observe the physique of the people who dwell in the vicinity before beginning to conduct the water. And if their frames are strong, their complexions fresh, legs sound, and eyes clear, the springs deserve complete approval. In other words, 3,000 years ago, he did not need a report from EPA saying that if you drink this water, you're going to get sick. 3,000 years ago, he said, look at the people. If they don't look healthy, don't use that spring. Now, just thinking about a meeting in Nairobi a couple of months ago, it was 120 countries from around the world, and we were talking about major environmental issues. Now, there are 53 countries in Africa, and they were quite concerned with what the Western government representatives were saying. We were concerned about water quality, whether or not the water was good that comes from the public drinking water system. They were furious because they said, we are talking about sub-Saharan Africa. We're talking about access to any kind of water. Whereas the US and Western countries, no, that's not our concern. We're talking about water quality rather than access to water. Now, this is what was said in 2005 in this article. More than 1 billion people lack clean water. 1 billion people lack clean water. 2 billion live in water-stressed countries like Jordan, where the demand for water will double in the next 20 years from population growth, expansion of irrigated agriculture, and increased industrial development. Nearly 2.6 billion people, there's only 6 billion on the planet. Half of the developing world lack adequate sanitation, which contributes to 900 million cases of diarrheal disease, 200 million schistosomiasis and bilharzia, and 900 million cases of hookworm each year. 2 million children die every year for want of fresh water and sanitation. Cholera, typhoid, and paratyphoid also continue to scourge human populations. That's in the developing world. Let's talk about Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has been a possession, a territory of the United States since the end of the Spanish-American War. Puerto Rico is an island with approximately 5 million inhabitants. 300,000 of those people rely on rainwater. They have these antiquated water systems that violate EPA's, the United States laws, Clean Water Act. But that's the only way that they can live. Now remember, Vitruvius said everybody needs water. They're not connected to the Puerto Rican aqueduct system because it costs too much money to send the water up the mountains. So people collect the rainwater. They have these antiquated water systems, antiquated pipes. As you go down the mountain, the same water that others have used, you use to eat, to clean, and other things. It's dirty water. Patillas is a city in the southeastern section of Puerto Rico. This was a newspaper headline, July 12, 2007. Patalenas utilize water not suitable for human consumption. Now, this is not an isolated incident. You see it many times in Puerto Rico. 76 families, 260 people, including 50 children, and more than a dozen adults over 60. Remember what I said, infants and the elderly, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. They used untreated water directly from the river. The health department said the water was not appropriate for human consumption. And remember, they're violating the laws, U.S. laws as it relates to the Clean Water Act. Okay. That's just a little bit about the human environment challenges that many people here in the United States and in the world face. The biggest problem is water. What's going to happen as far as water is concerned? If global warming has any validity, it's going to impact everyone's water as a practical matter. So what is it that governments must do? What do we tell other governments to help them get on this environmental superhighway. We talked to them about good environmental governance. It's in my title, Senior Counsel for Environmental Governance. So we talk about good environmental governance. We say that it's absolutely essential as it relates to sustainable development. In 2002, the World Summit in South Africa on sustainable development made this statement, and the United States was part of the summit, and they agreed to it. All countries should strengthen governmental institutions, including by providing necessary infrastructure and providing transparency, accountability, and fair administrative and judicial institutions. They said, United States, you are traveling on this superhighway. What you must do, as far as the other countries are concerned, is help them. Provide capacity building training. Help these other countries get on the superhighway so that they can address the problems in their communities. What are the essential elements of good environmental governance? There are 8. Openness and transparency, fairness and equity, efficient and effective services, clear and transparent laws and regulations, consistency and coherence in policy formulation. This is something that we're going to be looking at. And then respect for the rule of law. Respect for the rule of law. In that same 2005 book, it said that good environmental governance depends on the rule of law. The rule of law, which is generally characterized as referring to states where the conduct is governed by a set of rules that are applied predictably, efficiently, and fairly by independent institutions. What does the rule of law mean? What does it conjure up in your mind when you refer to the rule of law? The rule of law is a term that has been bastardized by so many actors throughout the world. It's been used by dictators. It's been used by totalitarian governments. It's been used by social democratic governments. The same phrase, the rule of law. Everybody may look at that phrase differently as far as what it means as a practical matter. So what the American Bar Association has done, whose mission is to promote the rule of law, not only here in the United States, but throughout the world, they said, why don't we come up with a definition that everyone can agree with? In July of last year, 400 scholars, judges, practitioners, human rights activists, and others met in Vienna, Austria, to come up with a definition that everyone can agree with. The totalitarian governments, the dictators, as well as social democrats. Something that is not too Western. If it was perceived as Western, imposed by the West, there was going to be a negative reaction. So you had representatives from Middle East. You had representatives from South America and other places to come up with this definition that everyone can agree with. There are 4 principles. First is that government and its officials are accountable under the law. Accountable under the law. You are responsible as a government official to be accountable to the people. Here in the Library of Congress, they have an exhibit regarding Abraham Lincoln, of the people, by the people, and for the people. That's what the word accountable seems to suggest. Second principle, the laws are clear, publicized, and stable, and protect fundamental rights. Now, fundamental rights, what does that mean when you're thinking in terms of the environment? Some constitutions in various countries say that you have an absolute right to a clean and healthy environment. You have a human right to a clean and healthy environment. Chile says that. Some state constitutions here in the United States say that. In India, the Supreme Court of India said, you have a human right to a clean and healthy environment. This is a very important phrase, fundamental rights. It's very, very different from a privilege. Use this as an example. I am 18 years old. Do I have an absolute right to a driver's license? No. It's a privilege to drive. As long as you comply with the rules of the road, you will be allowed to continue to drive. You don't have a fundamental right to a driver's license. Now, a human right is something different. You possess this. This is inalienable to you as a human. This is what some governments have said. It is not in our Constitution at this particular point, but some believe that it should be. The third principle, the process by which the laws are enacted, administered, and enforced is accessible, fair, and efficient. And finally, the laws are upheld by an independent judiciary. It's not imposed by the government, by an independent judiciary. And the judges who are of sufficient number have adequate resources and reflect the makeup of the communities that they serve. That's the website to the ABA's World Justice Project. They are going to continue to meet, issue papers to come up with this whole notion of what the rule of law should be, whether or not it is enforceable, and how should it be implemented. On that website, it talks about the relationship between the rule of law and political development, the relationship between the rule of law and economic development, and the relationship between the rule of law and human rights. What we are talking about is a relationship between the rule of law and environmental protection. Okay. Part 3, implementing sound environmental policy. So what have we done thus far? We've described what human environment challenges actually are. We looked at the challenges that are facing so many people across this planet, not only domestically but internationally. We looked at developing sound environmental policy, a government's responsibility to do that, using the rule of law in order to achieve good environmental governance. Now we're talking about implementing sound environmental policy. This is something that I lifted from the Environmental Agency of Abu Dhabi. Abu Dhabi is a very, very rich country, oil-producing country. Oil was discovered in 1958, and their neighbor is Saudi Arabia. Kuwait is right next to it, and others. Abu Dhabi is like Washington, D.C. It's the capital of the United Arab Emirates. I was asked to participate in an environmental law and policy discussion to help Abu Dhabi, whose environmental agency has only been in existence for 4 years, to help them produce law, to help them understand what policy is all about. Abu Dhabi has only one environmental law for the entire country, one environmental law. So what we're going to be doing, among other things, is to help them develop solid waste legislation and also regulations. But this is what they said in their policy handbook. Environmental policy is any course of action deliberately taken or not taken to manage human activities with a view to prevent, reduce, or mitigate harmful effects on nature and natural resources, and ensuring that man-made changes to the environment do not have harmful effects on humans. Sounds good. Sounds very good. They go on to say that environmental policy focuses on problems arising from human impact on the environment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I said to them, what does that mean? Those are beautiful words on a piece of paper. What does it mean as far as the people of Abu Dhabi or the United Arab Emirates are concerned? They said to me, we have to come up with some kind of policy because global warming is affecting our country. And I said, the desert? They said, yes, we've never seen snow before. Snow in the desert. They said, we've lived here thousands of years. We've never seen snow. So it's impacting Abu Dhabi. They have to come up with environmental policy. So I said, okay, well, how do you make those words come to life? How do you make people understand that the environment is important when they have not had to be concerned about the environment until recently? Said, well, maybe what you can do is think about measuring the performance of your government. Now, that seemed a little strange because Abu Dhabi, the ruler of Abu Dhabi, who recently died maybe 6-7 years ago, he had 26 sons. And the 26 sons basically rule the country. They're in very key positions. So I said, well, what about performance-based management in this situation? I said, well, what about the public being involved in the decision-making process? The public need not be involved. We tell the public what the government needs to do at this particular point in order to protect them. We're not sure about this performance-based management stuff. So I said, okay, well, just be patient. Let's move through the process. Performance-based management is that you have got to set some goals as a government. You've got to measure what your performance is by setting these goals and having these measures, performance measures. I told them about some of the best practices, thoughtful use of goals and objectives and performance indicators. You have to think in terms of not just outputs, but intermediate and end outcomes. What is that? An output, if Christine from the Library of Congress said, the number of people who attended this particular presentation, that is an output. We can count the heads. But then what about the impact on what is being said on the people? How about the fact that they are decision makers and they're concerned about the environment and public health? Now transpose this into a government in Abu Dhabi, a government in Jordan, a government in Kenya. How do you show that there's an improvement to the environment and the public health of the people? The only way that you can do that is have these outcomes, performance outcomes and outputs. The third is regular management reports on key outputs and outcomes to monitor the operations, review the performance of the programs, identify and correct the performance issues, and have these reports to the public and to the leadership of Abu Dhabi to show that there is support for some of the things that the Environment Agency is doing. We talked about how performance measures have evolved over the years. Then we only looked at, from the enforcement point of view, the number of inspections, the number of enforcement actions, and the dollars. If we show that there are more inspections, if we show that there are more dollars, then we have a successful enforcement program. But I said, no, that's not enough. You have to look into the dollars that are invested into pollution control in the businesses, the improved facility management practices, the pounds of pollution that have been reduced, and the health benefits. You have to go beyond simply looking at outputs. You have to look at the impact of what you're doing as a result of your policy. Now, just think for a moment about a permit. The government gives permit to an applicant who wants to open a facility. What is a permit? A permit is nothing more than a license to pollute. If your facility is this large, you will have a license given to you by the government to emit contaminants into the atmosphere. How do you determine whether or not you are enforcing the laws? How do you determine that the conditions of the permits are being complied with? How do you ensure that the permits are not interfering with public health? Those are the measures, those are the performance measures that we need to address. Here in EPA, we looked at, in 2007, the 12 largest enforcement actions under the Clean Air Act. And we said, did they reduce emissions of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter? Granted, they're very, very successful, but what about the public health aspects? 500 fewer premature deaths in people with heart or lung disease, 1,000 fewer hospital and emergency room visits, 1,500 fewer cases of chronic bronchitis and acute bronchitis. Again, you have to show that there is not only an environmental impact, but a public health impact. This is what we are telling foreign governments what they must do in order to be traveling on the environmental superhighway. Jordan is a current example. We have 3 train-the-trainer workshops in Jordan. What we can't do, EPA, because of limited resources, travel all around the world. If we do a training in 2006, we should not be going back to Jordan in 2009. We have to grow this environmental law and policy exponentially. What we're doing is planting a seed. You must run with it, the government of Jordan. We can't continue to come back to Jordan time and time again. It's nice trips. I wouldn't mind going back to Jordan. But, we can't do it if we are going to market this whole notion of good environmental governance and have these countries adopted as their own. One of the things that we did with Jordan is that they said, look, we're going to negotiate beforehand with you what the performance measures will be for the Ministry of Environment inspectors, for their environmental rangers. These are the police, environmental police in Jordan, and also judges. Now, judges don't like to be measured. Their performances, they don't like to be measured. They think in terms of this is an independent judiciary, but believe it or not, the judges agreed to performance measures. They said that what we need to do is to issue decisions that do have an impact on the environment and public health, and we're not just going to look at the number of decisions, but the impact of those decisions on Jordanian society. So what is Jordan doing now? They're developing sound environmental policy through good environmental governance practices. They are initiating a process for training the environmental police and others, and they may become members of the Global Legal Information Network. The Global GLIN is a tremendous tool. You have the laws of other countries at your keyboard, right in front of you. When I was in Jordan, when I was in Abu Dhabi, I said, well, look, this is what your neighbor is doing, Kuwait. Kuwait has all of these laws. Doesn't it make sense for you to have your laws as a part of the GLIN network? 51 countries, I believe, at this particular point have their laws. And all you have to do is look at glin.gov, and you can look at what others are doing around the world. They're implementing sound environmental policy through an evolving environmental regulatory infrastructure with progressive ministry leadership. Minister Irani is a very proactive minister. He wants Jordan to be a leader in the Middle East. He wants other countries to come to Jordan and to participate in these trainings. George will be eventually developing clear annual and long-term goals. They will be training and assigning specific ministry personnel to achieve the ministry goals who will have the requisite authority and resources. And finally, they will be ensuring continuous accountability of ministry personnel in achieving those goals and efficiently using the resources to achieve them. So what's the lesson learned from all of this? What I said earlier, what was said in the summit in South Africa on sustainable development. Good environmental governance and the rule of law are essential to achieving sustainable development. It's essential to achieving environmental justice here in the United States. And what we as an agency are doing, we're promoting good environmental governance, we're promoting the use of the rule of law, and we're saying to these other countries, this is absolutely the only way that you'll be able to achieve sustainable development for your country. A plus B equals C. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Hi, thanks for your talk. What are the priorities for the Office of International Affairs, like in terms of what, like global warming, or is it providing capacity building? What are?
Well, it's number one is to promote good environmental governance. That's one of the strategic areas. Another one is to deal with other governments in a transparent way, and I have to say that these were strategic action items under the previous administration. What's being done right now, they're changing those priorities because of the incoming administration and the ideas. We don't have a new assistant administrator. As a matter of fact, our hearings are going to be tomorrow. So I say, assuming that she gets through that process, we'll be seeing what the new priorities will be. But promoting good environmental governance is something that's going to continue. This is what the agency, what the United States, the State Department has agreed to over the years. And the only way that we can address the issue of global warming is by working hand in hand with what we call the BRICS. That's Brazil, Russia, India, and China. That's the only way that this major issue is going to be addressed. And as I was saying earlier, Africa has 53 countries. They are the region of the world that are going to be most severely impacted by global warming. They're the region of the world that has less resources to deal with this particular issue. When I was in Kenya, we took a trip to Mount Kilimanjaro, and the ice, it's melting. It's no longer there. They're still having trips up the mountain, but the ice is, I don't know how long it's going to stay there. But Africa has no way of dealing with this very, very serious issue. Even though it's not responsible for creating this problem, it's being impacted severely by that problem. Yes?
I enjoyed this session very much, and it's very enlightening. But since the United States is spending so much time and energy in Jordan, are there any penalties for the rule of law when it's broken?
Wow, that's a good question. Penalties by whom?
By the United States, or since they're spending so much time and energy and money in Jordan, or any country that's involved in the Glenn program, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
What penalties do they incur if they keep on breaking or not adhering to the rule of law?
Well, that's up to the particular country. What we're doing is that the rule of law is not an international rule of law. The rule of law is their law.
Okay.
their laws that are specific to that particular country, and they are involved with enforcing their own law. There is no international rule of law per se. What we're saying is that there are basic principles in all of the rules of law as it relates to the domestic laws. But no, there's no enforcement. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about the importance of data and information as indicators for problems and mass problems. Do we have all the data and information that we need as indicators and we're just not paying attention to it or ignoring it? Or are there areas where we really need to do some more research?
There are areas where we absolutely need to do more research. One of the biggest controversies when we were trying to put together the database was the stress and strain between the environmental indicators and the public health indicators. The argument was that the science is not there. You cannot say that because these facilities exist, the high incidence of cancer, the high incidence of respiratory ailments came about as a result of the exposure. And that's absolutely correct. The argument, we said, was, well, look, make the information available. How people analyze it and the conclusions that they've reached, that's up to them. We're not dictating anything. We're not making any assertions at all. We're just providing information. And, you know, I'd say information goes through different levels. You have, at the first level, raw facts. These facts really don't mean anything to anybody. They're just facts. But then at some point, those facts become information. Information is something that could be analyzed and understood. And then if you take it a step further, that information becomes intelligence, something that you could use as a practical matter in order to make sound decisions. So we go from facts to information to intelligence. Now, how people reach it, when they reach it, that's up to them. We just want to make the information available. There's so much more that needs to be done. The databases are constantly evolving. As the Department of Health and Human Services gets more information as it relates to public health, and they input into their computers, and then EPA can have access to that information through the health indicators. Again, it's just information that people can use and interpret any way that they want. But a lot more information needs to be collected, and then the analysis of the information, making that one-to-one connection, a lot more needs to be done from that point of view. Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
You're welcome.
I have a couple of questions. At the beginning of your discussion, you mentioned that what you do, your office do, it's exporting intelligence to some of the developing countries.
And at the same time, importing intelligence, because you're constantly learning from people back and forth.
So the question is, what or how many countries your office right now is providing legal technical assistance? And what is their distribution? And also whether you have major cooperative programs in these leading developing countries, such as India, China, Brazil, and Russia.
Well, the Office of International Affairs is functioning primarily as a liaison. We work with other technical experts in the Office of General Counsel, in the Office of Air, the Office of Water, whatever it is that the country X or country Y is looking for. We get all kinds of requests on a daily basis from other governments, from NGOs, from embassies, U.S. embassies around the world. And what we have to do is to try to prioritize. Of course, as I said before, the BRICS, they're most important right now because they are emitting a lot of, the argument is that they're contributing, just like the United States, to this major issue called global warming. It's going to affect all of us. It is affecting all of us, and that's why we need to get it right, and we need to work cooperatively on this very issue. So what I'm saying is that depending on the request, depending on the availability of technical expertise within the agency, depending on what the priorities are as set by the Department of State as far as foreign policy is concerned, that's what we will do. That's where we are engaged. So it's evolving, it changes from year to year, perhaps because of all that's going on right now in the world. There may be different signals from the Obama administration. Again, the Obama administration is very, very new. We don't know where things are going. We're going to continue to promote good environmental governance, but where that might be, I just can't say at this particular point. But those 4 countries, Russia, India, China, they're very, very important at this particular point. And I would assume that they are going to continue to be very important.
Do you have current programs, technical assistance in these countries?
Yes.
You do?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier, is carbon emissions one of the indicators of global warming?
That's in the database?
Yeah.
That I don't know. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Specifically, I don't know the answer to that question. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'd like to go back to the question that was asked earlier about the international dimensions of all of this. And
Mm-hmm.
you talked about the rule of law and the importance of enforcement. And when we're talking about global problems, whether it be climate change or fishery depletions or biodiversity loss, the actions and the consequences are not necessarily from the same place.
Mm-hmm.
And we do not have, as you said, a global rule of law for the environment, even though we do have some international environmental law, and much less any enforcement authority over anybody internationally. So personally, if you were to speak off the record as an EPA official, as an environmental, part of the environmental movement, as someone who's been working on these issues, what do you see the needs are when we're dealing with global problems for rule of law and for enforcement, and what is the plausibility that something like this might come to life?
Well, I can't speak off the record. I don't think transparency has gone that far. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, and it's a good question, very broad question, and I don't feel comfortable answering that question right now in this setting. Mm-hmm. One more question.
One more. I will take that one.
Yes, yes.
You mentioned the ABA conference in Vienna last
Mm-hmm.
year, and I was fortunate to be there too.
Mm-hmm.
And one of these major divisions, I think, between developing countries is how they interpret the concept of rule of law.
Yeah.
Because there are developing countries, they would say we have the rule of law, but we call it a rule by law.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a difference between rule of law and rule by law.
Yeah.
So how do you see these two conceptual difference would be manifested in the enforcement of law in the environmental area?
I think it's too early to hazard a guess or interpretation as far as where things are going with respect to rule by law as compared to rule of law. I think that there's going to be a need for a lot more discussion and analysis and interpretation, and also coordination between so many different people and governments. Where things are going to come out, I have no way of knowing. I don't have a crystal ball in front of me as a practical matter. I think that there's going to be a tremendous amount of effort because the World Justice Project is fairly new, and it's going to continue, and it's a concerted effort that's going to have to take place with so many different people. So we're just going to have to see what's going to happen as the years go by. But good question.
Well, please join me in thanking our speaker, Barry Hill, for a very enlightening construct and giving us a way to think about these problems and these issues. And I want to also thank you personally for your endorsement of the Global Legal Information Network, and I hope we can continue to work together on spreading the rule of law throughout the world. Thank
Absolutely.
you very, very much.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.